Welcome back! My name is Baller Scuba. This is Video Games Over Time. We are still in 1985. Today, we're going to talk about some more honorable mentions of 1985. In 1985, Gremlin Graphics released Thing on a Spring to British computers. Programmed by Jason Perkins and Anthony Clark, with art by Mark Rogers and music by Rob Hubbard, Thing on a Spring is a puzzle platform game. The player plays as the Thing on a Spring and must kill the evil goblin and save all the toys in the factory. The game was reviewed well at the time, particularly for its graphics and sound. On October 1st, 1985, Apple discontinued the Macintosh 128K. Originally released in January 1984, the Macintosh 128K was quickly replaced by the Macintosh 512K, or Fat Mac. The low amount of memory with the inability for the consumer to add RAM would ultimately doom the system when compared to the more powerful Macintosh 512K. In 1985, Epyx released Rescue on Fractalus to American computers and the Atari 5200. The game was developed by Lucasfilm Games, specifically David Fox, Lauren Carpenter, Peter Langston, Charlie Kellner, and Gary Winnick. Rescue on Fractalus is a shooting game. The player controls a Valkyrie space fighter who must go on a search and rescue mission to pick up downed pilots on the planet. The game got mixed reviews from critics. In October 1985, Konami released Konami GT to Japanese arcades. Konami GT was originally known as Konami RF2 Red Fighter, a sequel to Konami's 1984 arcade game Road Fighter. Konami GT is a racing game. The player drives a sports car and must reach checkpoints before running out of fuel. The game was praised at the time for its graphics. In October 1985, TSR released Oriental Adventures. Written by Gary Gygax, David Zeb Cook, and Francois Marcella Fraudeval, Oriental Adventures is a rulebook for advanced Dungeons & Dragons. It adds 10 new classes and 3 new races for AD&D, as well as introduced non-weapon proficiencies. This was the first publication by TSR to focus entirely on a non-Western setting. The sourcebook was reviewed very well at the time. In October 1985, Data East ported Karate Champ to American computers. This release of Karate Champ would become very popular, selling over 500,000 units by January 1989. This makes Karate Champ, at least according to the Software Publishers Association, one of the top 2 best-selling computer games through June 1989. In 1985, Cascade Games released Ace to British computers. Programmed by Ian Martin with art by Damon Redmond, Ace is a combat flight simulator. The player plays as a fighter jet pilot who must defend the English coast from an enemy invasion. The game was reviewed well by critics at the time. In October 1985, Activision ported Ghostbusters to the Atari 2600. Ported by Dan Kitchen, this version of the popular computer game would not be popular on the Atari 2600 console. It is said the Atari 2600 version of Ghostbusters only sold 40,000 units. In 1985, Activision released Hacker to American computers. Developed by Brad Freger and Steve Cartwright, Hacker is a strategy game. The player controls a hacker who accidentally gets access to a non-public system. The player is given no instructions with the game and must sort out what to do for themselves, but this will include controlling a robot and collecting evidence from spies. The game sold fairly well, selling more than 50,000 copies by late 1987. In October 1985, Coleco discontinued the ColecoVision. Originally released in August 1982, the ColecoVision would prove to be successful in the United States, selling over 2 million units. it would see a total of 168 games released for it. Most of these games, including the ones we have covered throughout the console's lifespan, were ports of popular arcade games. More powerful than the Atari 2600, the ColecoVision had expansions for it that would be able to play all Atari 2600 games, as well as a computer expansion, the Coleco Atom. However, the video game crash of 1983, as well as the failure of the Coleco Atom, would ultimately doom the console. Coleco withdrew from the video game market in 1985, instead focusing on their toy line, particularly their Cabbage Patch Kids line of dolls. In October 1985, Hudson Soft ported Excitebike to Japanese computers. This version of the game would not nearly be as successful as either the Famicom or arcade versions of the game. In 1985, Gremlin Graphics released Grumpy Gumphrey Supersleuth to the ZX Spectrum. Developed by Sean Hollingworth, Grumpy Gumphrey Supersleuth is an adventure game. The player plays as a store detective, Grumpy Gumphrey, who must try to keep his job. He must do the tasks given to him by various shoppers, including pest control, maintenance, and cleaning before time runs out in order to not be fired. The game was reviewed well at the time. In October 1985, Epyx released Winter Games to American computers. A winter-themed follow-up to Summer Games, Winter Games featured several different events depending on the platform it was released on, including slalom skiing, ski jumping, biathlon, bobsled, figure skating, speed skating, luge, freestyle skiing, called hot dog aerials in the game, and free skating. It was originally designed by Richard Ditton, with art from Lonnie Ropp and Michael Kosaka, and music from David Thiel. Winter Games would be one of Epyx's early best-sellers, selling 250,000 copies by November 1989. In 1985, T&E Soft released Hydlide 2: Shine of Darkness for the PC 8801. A sequel to Hydlide, Hydlide 2 is a role-playing game. The game adds to the original Hydlide's formula by introducing a morality system, ranging from justice to evil, adds townsfolk with dialogue to provide clues and training to the player, and introduces a time option to allow the player to speed up or slow down the game. On October 22, 1985, the Blooms sold their stock in TSR. After having a falling out with Gary Gygax, who had a controlling interest in the company, the Blooms exercised their options to buy more shares in the company, then sold those shares to Lorraine Williams. Lorraine Williams had been hired by TSR as a manager in 1984. With the Blooms shares and some shares of her own, Williams became the majority shareholder in TSR and deposed Gygax as CEO and president. On October 23, 1985, Capcom released Gun.Smoke to arcades. Designed by Yoshiki Okamoto, with music from Ayako Mori, Gun.Smoke is a shooting game. The player plays as Billy Bob, a bounty hunter going after criminals in the Wild West. The game has an automatic scroll with 3 buttons for 3 different directions the player can shoot. In November 1985, Namco released Alpha Mission to arcades. Known as ASO, Armored Scrum Object in Japan, Alpha Mission was developed by Koji Obata at SNK with art from Rampty. Alpha Mission is a shooter where the player must fight off waves of enemies, with lasers for air enemies and missiles for ground enemies. In November 1985, Synapse Software released Lode Runner's Rescue to American computers. Designed by Joshua Scholar, Lode Runner's Rescue is a sequel to Doug Smith's Lode Runner. It changes things from the original game in several ways, including an isometric perspective. On November 21, 1985, Namco ported Pac-Land to the Famicom. This version of the 1984 arcade game would be relatively successful in Japan, where the arcade game was still popular. On November 24th, 1985, ABC aired Ewoks: The Battle for Endor on American television. Directed by Ken and Jim Wheat with a story by George Lucas, Ewoks: The Battle for Endor is a sequel to Caravan of Courage, an Ewok adventure. Taking place 6 months after the first film, this film follows a family who lands on Endor. A nearby Ewok village is attacked while they are fixing their Star Cruiser, and the family must join the Ewoks to defeat the marauders that have taken control of Endor. The television film was not reviewed well. On November 27, 1985, Namco ported BurgerTime to the Famicom. This Famicom version of the 3-year-old arcade title would not be particularly successful. In 1985, Epyx released Ballblazer to American computers. The game was developed by Lucasfilm Games, specifically by David Levine, Peter Langston, David Riordan, and Gary Hare, with music by Russell Lieblich. Ballblazer is a sports-like arcade game. The player's goal is to score points by either carrying or shooting a floating ball into their opponent's goal. The player can also shoot their opponent to try and knock the ball loose if their opponent has possession. The game was reviewed well at the time. On December 5th, 1985, SoftPro ported Karateka to the Famicom. This version of the game was fairly accurate to the original version, with SoftPro labeling the martial arts in the game as Nanto Saishi Ken, or South Dipper Retry Fist. On December 6th, 1985, Namco released Star Luster for the Famicom. Set in the same universe as Namco's Bosconian, Star Luster is a space combat simulator. Similar to Atari's Star Raiders, Star Luster has the player go through open space through a first-person cockpit view using a map and radar to defeat enemies and refueling at bases. The game is also one of the first games with a regenerating shield. At the time, the game was not well reviewed and did not sell well. However, modern reviews have been very positive about the game. On December 11th, 1985, Capcom ported 1942 for the Famicom. The first Capcom game for the console, this port of 1942 was developed by Micronix. This version of the 1984 arcade game would prove to be very successful. In December 1985, Ocean Software released Rambo to British computers. Styled on screen as Rambo First Blood Part 2, this computer game based on the film was designed by David Collier and Tony Pomfret. Heavily inspired by Capcom's Commando, Rambo has the player play as Rambo, who must rescue hostages and return to the extraction point, fighting enemies along the way. The game was popular in the United Kingdom and was reviewed fairly well. In December 1985, Namco released Sky Kid to Japanese arcades. Sky Kid is a horizontally scrolling shooter. 2 players can play at the same time, controlling the Sky Kids, Red Baron, and Blue Max. The Sky Kids are given the task of bombing specific targets, but the players must defeat enemies to make it back to the targets. The game would be fairly successful in Japan. In December 1985, Kung Fu Master was ported to American computers. These versions of the game received mixed reviews depending on the system that the game was released for. In December 1985, Epyx released the Eidolon to American computers. Developed by Charlie Kellner of Lucasfilm Games, the Eidolon is an adventure game. The player finds a strange vehicle, known as the Eidolon, which transports them to another dimension. The player's goal is to navigate all the game's levels, defeating enemies and replenishing the Eidolon's energy along the way. In December 1985, Epyx released Koronis Rift to American computers. It was developed by Lucasfilm Games, specifically by Noah Falstein, Charlie Kellner, Eric Wilmender, and Ron Gilbert, with art by Gary Winnick and James St. Louis, and music by Douglas Crockford. Koronis Rift is a strategy game. The player controls a vehicle and must enter rifts on an alien planet. The ultimate goal of the game is to make it to the 20th rift to destroy the saucer control base Hulk. Along the way, the player must find out which weapon and shield modules on the vehicle work best against which enemies. On December 19th, 1985, Hudson Soft ported Bomberman to the Famicom. This version of the 1983 game would become by far the most popular and most well-known. In 1985, Personal Software Services released Swords and Sorcery to British computers. Designed by Michael Simpson and Paul Hutchinson, Swords and Sorcery is a role-playing game. The player gets to choose their character, then explore the catacombs of a land named Zob, trying to find the 7 pieces of sacred Zob armor. The game was reviewed well by critics at the time. On December 19th, 1985, Square ported Thexder to the Famicom. The first Famicom game from Square, this version of Thexder would be relatively popular in Japan, adding to the game's eventual 1,000,000 copies total. In 1985, Broderbund published Moebius, the Orb of Celestial Harmony, to American computers. Designed by Greg Malone and produced by Origin Systems, Moebius is a role-playing game. In the game, the player must recover the Orb of Celestial Harmony from the evil Kaiman. To do this, the player has to train their body and soul, then travel through the 4 elemental planes of earth, water, air, and fire while keeping their karma up. The game received mixed reviews at the time. Overall, 1985 was a bit of a mixed year for video games. The arcade market began to recover from the video game crash of 1983. However, the home video game market in America continued to fall. Home video game sales in America fell to just $100 million overall, over $292 million in 2024. The Atari 2600 only saw 4 more games released for it in 1985. Despite still being the most well-known console in America at the end of 1985, there just was not a lot being developed for the console, which was still seen as failing. Its library still stands at roughly 500 games. The Intellivision only saw 2 more games released for it in 1985. That brings its total to 106 games. In Japan, the Famicom is growing and adding to its library quickly. In 1985, the Famicom saw 69 more games released for it in 1985, bringing its total to 97 games. Nintendo also released 2 new Game & Watch games in 1985, bringing its total to 47 different games. Nintendo also released 6 more games for their Versus System arcade cabinets, including the first developed by a third-party company, Namco. That brings the Versus System's number of games to 19. In computers, the overall computer video game market is still split into 3 main markets: the European market, the American market, and the Japanese market. While the most popular games will tend to cross over between markets, the majority of games are still locked in their region. In the American computer market, despite 2 replacements for the computer developed by Commodore in 1985, the Commodore 64 continues to dominate the American market. In 1985 alone, it sold 1 million units. That will do it for the honorable mentions of 1985. My name is Baller Scuba. This has been Video Games Over Time. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in our next video when we review the year that was 1985.